Welcome back to the American Soccer Crash Course. Emergency Pod Edition, first of 2023. We're going to shake off the rust while dealing with probably a pretty crazy topic today, one that's going to grab headlines really in all of American sports news and probably news around the country as well, but and around the football world, the soccer world. So this saga seems like it's just never goes away, and even when it looked like it was taking the form of something completely different, we had a crazy revelation today that proves it's all part of the same crazy Gio Reyna saga. So, Max, I think I'd ask you for your first take on it, but maybe it makes more sense if we just get into some timelines and feelings along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We had talked a couple weeks ago about reuniting for a check-in podcast, but with the topic being transfer news, right? Transfer wish lists and updates on players. But here we are, and it's about the same drama. It's really an episode of The Real Housewives unfolding for the U.S. men's national team. But here we are, and it is pretty juicy. So I say we just get right into it and start at the beginning. But it's a lot. It's a lot to process for sure.
So we what did we pump out, like 17 episodes in 2 months? So we were kind of tired, man. Like we'd just gotten out our World Cup wrap episode when the initial Gio Reyna drama kind of dropped, and we didn't do an emergency pod that time. But I think we're gonna make it up for it here, and I think we can honestly get our takes on that. So just before we go into all the new developments of the last few days. To give people a refresh, you had this situation with Gio Reyna where he mysteriously did not play at the World Cup, and then eventually he got off the bench a couple times, but everyone was really critiquing and criticizing Berhalter for Gio's lack of playing time. 3 days after the World Cup, Berhalter goes to a leadership seminar. And I don't know if you've looked at the details of how that story actually came out, but essentially Berhalter thought he was speaking off the record, and some random guy at a random company, that guy knew nothing about soccer, just published this article detailing leadership tips from U.S. men's soccer coach. He had no idea what he was doing, and he essentially divulged that Gregg Berhalter, when prompted with a question of what is a conflict in your team that you dealt with? How did you deal with it? He presented the case of Gio Reyna at the World Cup without specifically naming Gio Reyna, but very heavily alluding to, a lot of the mystery that surrounded Reyna's lack of playing time, essentially saying that there was a player who wasn't meeting the standard of the team. It was really bad. They threatened to send him home because of how bad it was. And, eventually, they decided not to, but they had him apologize to the team. The team held him accountable, and that was how they dealt with it. But this person who published the report was explicitly told by somebody at the event, which remains mysterious, that he could publish this piece that was supposed to be off the record, in which Berhalter effectively outs Gio Reyna. And so the response was pretty scathing from everyone, saying, Berhalter, why would you throw your player under the bus like that? And Gio Reyna himself released a statement the following day after that news broke, just basically sticking up for himself and saying he was disappointed that after everything had been dealt with in-house, that Berhalter would continue to speak publicly, albeit under the guise of supposed off the record, but speak publicly about that incident. And he was, basically trying to clear his name and taking a kind of subtle or not so subtle shot at U.S. soccer in the process. So, Max, to get your thoughts, just to wrap that situation up, many of our listeners may be kind of familiar with that already, but what were your thoughts about that whole situation, and where did you stand on Berhalter after that situation?
Yeah, so it's honestly hard to go back in time and evaluate that situation again after what's happened, because it's really put a whole different lens on how I felt about Berhalter at the time. But it was an unfortunate situation at the time. You obviously didn't like to see all the stuff going on with Gio in the first place. You would have liked to see him have a better attitude to begin with. Yeah. The stuff getting out obviously isn't ideal, and so I can, in a sense, like understand the frustration of that getting out. Like in a team situation like that, you want to keep it in house. It's unfortunate it happened the way that it did. But like you said, it was supposed to be an off the record thing. So I guess I have some sympathy there, but all around, not a great situation, not a great reflection on Gio to begin with. But also, maybe a slight fumble by Gregg, being a little bit careless, with that information, but honestly, it's hard. I'm having a hard time like putting myself back to where we were
okay,
then.
Fair enough, yeah.
Because now this what's happened since has really just completely flipped my perspective on how it went down. But yeah, it started out unfortunate, but just continued to spiral places we did not expect it to go.
Absolutely. So to get to the spiraling, we all kind of thought that was dead and buried. There's been lots of speculation on Gregg Berhalter's job. He actually, his contract ran out on, at the end of the year. So the U.S. is without a coach. We just hired somebody to be an interim coach who doesn't seem like a very good coach, but that's not the issue at this very moment.
Here nor there.
Yeah. So essentially, U.S. Soccer yesterday kind of released this semi-mysterious statement. I'll go ahead and read it. Upon learning about the allegation of U.S. men's national team coach, or the allegation against U.S. men's national team coach Gregg Berhalter on December 11th, 2022, that is the day of the news breaking about Gregg at the conference. That's that day that this allegation in question is being talked about. U.S. Soccer immediately hired Alston and Bird LLP, some independent investigator, to look into the matter, and the investigation remains ongoing. Throughout this process, this is a direct quote, throughout this process, U.S. Soccer has learned about potential inappropriate behavior towards multiple members of our staff by individuals outside of our organization. We take such behavior seriously and have expanded our investigation to include those allegations. So interestingly, tons of drama went down today. I would note, just as a sidebar, none of that was the topic of today's craziness. And we'll see what happens with that. But to get back to the statement, we appreciate Gregg and Rosalind coming forward, Rosalind being Gregg's wife, coming forward to speak about this incident consistent with our consistent transparency. We'll share the results of the investigation and take this seriously. And also, they just basically said that they were going to launch a full-scale kind of review of the U.S. Soccer performance and what they should do with the coach. So the interesting thing about that was it was kind of like, what allegations? Like, what are you talking about? It was unclear exactly what they meant by this. And that's because Gregg Berhalter has been a smart man in one regard, and he stayed off Twitter. But yesterday, the allegations that they're talking about, Gregg Berhalter, no tweets, and he did on Instagram
no blue
too.
check mark.
No blue check mark. Like, people totally speculating, like, is this the guy? Gregg Berhalter _ So he must have like a hater out there, who took his name. But so kind of, I used the U.S. Soccer thing first because that was kind of what bubbled to the surface first, and then people found the Gregg statement. But so here's the Gregg Berhalter statement from his newly made Twitter and Instagram. And essentially what it boils down to, it's a big, long statement, but these are the two big paragraphs. So he says, during the World Cup, an individual contacted U.S. Soccer saying that they had information about me that would, quote, take me down, an apparent effort to leverage something very personal from long ago to bring about the end of my relationship with U.S. Soccer. This is a difficult step to take, but my wife, Rosalind, and I wanted to clearly and directly share the truth. This is a story that belongs to us, but hopefully there are lessons that can be valuable to others. In fall of 1991, I met my soulmate. I just turned 18 and was a freshman in college when I met Rosalind for the first time. There was a familiar feeling when we spoke. She's an amazing person. To get more to the point, One night while out drinking at a local bar, Rosalind and I had a heated argument that continued outside. It became physical, and I kicked her in the legs. There are zero excuses for my actions that night. It was a shameful moment, one that I regret to this day. I immediately apologized, but she wanted nothing to do with me. Essentially, he goes on to say that he, did therapy while he was at North Carolina, and 7 months later, he and Rosalind reconnected, and they've been married for 30 years since. And so, clearly implying that this was the evidence that this supposed person making these threats was presenting. Max, did you have, when you were reading those yesterday, to take you back to yesterday, what were your initial thoughts on the statement and U.S. Soccer statement?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the initial situation is terrible, but my first reaction was, especially something so long ago, I sort of felt a little bit bad for Gregg, and particularly his wife, that, an incident that had been dealt with and had been handled privately for decades had to come to the surface. But, with how that being brought to the attention of U.S. Soccer, you do, if anything like that is brought to the surface, I think as U.S. Soccer, you do have a responsibility to investigate with the way things are now. Yep. It's unfortunate that it had to come up, and I feel particularly bad for his wife. And I do feel bad that it's a little bit like of a violation of privacy, like Gregg referenced in his statement. Like that was, that was an incident that was handled between them. That it's not like it was a complete secret that he had completely shielded, like people in their lives that had a right to know knew.
Right.
And it's not something that he ever hid from people that are important in his life.
Right.
It never needed to be something that was broadcast to this level. But once it was, it's the U.S. men's soccer had no choice but to look into it.
Right.
But my first reaction from that statement was I felt bad for Gregg and particularly his wife, because this is something that shouldn't have been brought to the surface at this point.
Yeah.
What about you? How did you feel?
In complete agreement. And I guess my thought was like, somebody really thought they did something here. Like they were like, oh, I got it. Like I got the dirt on them. And it's like, 30 years ago, it's not even like, if it was a random girl, I guess that's one thing. It's his wife who he's been happily married to. And like, clearly it's a non-issue. And like, statute of limitations plus what the violence itself.
Yeah. And if it was like you said, and if it was a situation where like, the victim who, like you said, maybe wasn't his wife and came out and was like, no, that actually wasn't, like there was sort of more of an adversarial kind of spin to it still, where like she was like, oh, like, no, that was terrible. Like,
and it got covered up.
Right. And there was a cover, but that is completely not the case. They're married.
Right.
The situation was obviously handled. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't even a secret from their own children. Right. Like their family knew. So my main takeaway was it's unfortunate that it had to bubble to the surface the way it did.
Yeah, absolutely. And so everyone was in a state of confusion, particularly with the U.S. Soccer, like the order of that, as I described, or Berhalter, you didn't even know he was on Twitter, and just even the weird thing about the U.S. Soccer statement where they said like, and there's other allegations between other people. I just didn't. It was a little hard to make sense of a little bit. But it became clear late last night that essentially shit was going to go down today. Like a couple reporters, a CBS reporter, Heath Pierce, who used to be on the team, basically said like tomorrow a lot of things are going to become clear, which is feels like crazy reporting to me to just be able to do that. But I mean,
yeah,
I know you're trying to drum up, I guess, interest, but I don't know. It is kind of funny. Like I feel like throughout this, I'm kind of like looking at things. I'm like, if this was the NBA, I feel like, this media member would have handled this better, or this party would have not made this misstep. But it feels like a little bit almost like inexperienced and raw or something like. But yeah, so to get to the craziness today, people started connecting the dots last night when it became when speculation built that today was going to be the day that a lot of the backstory, the blackmail or threat, I shouldn't say blackmail, but threat, was found out. And people connected the dots, and they said Claudio Reyna and Gregg Berhalter, Claudio Reyna being Gio Reyna's father, they go way back. They went to high school together. They were on the same soccer team from the age they were like sophomores in high school. And I actually read that Claudio Reyna was the best man at Gregg Berhalter's wedding. So that's about the series of best friends you can get. And then this is also just wild to me because given the timeline, but Mrs. Reyna, Danielle Reyna, and Rosalind Berhalter, who is Gregg Berhalter's wife, they were roommates at North Carolina on the soccer team, which I mean, I'm sure there's some connection there where, soccer players are pretty likely to maybe date other soccer players, but that's just crazy in and of itself. And then to have him be the coach and Gio be on the team, it's like even crazier. But yes,
I mean, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
you would think that's like a dream come true. Like, as a friend, it's like that's something you talk about like with your friend in college. Like, oh, wouldn't that be crazy if I coach your son and our sons are? It's just like that should be awesome, and like it should be a moment of like gratification and like joy for both parties.
Yeah,
like, look at this. Like, isn't this crazy?
And he's like really good. Like he's really good on the national team.
Yeah,
like, he's not like
So it's crazy.
Do you think that maybe? Bit of a leading question, but do you think that kind of sweet spot or, family connection, do you think that probably has something to do with him telling Gio so upfrontly about his role at the World Cup?
I don't know. It's weird. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. It's just, I think so.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
the logic doesn't like totally support, like, because so many people were killing him for that. And I'm like, that might have something to do with it. Just like, I really care about this kid. I want to let him know that I'm not going to, play him all the time. I don't know. Yeah,
but I can even see it going the opposite way. Like, you would maybe think that he would be more sympathetic to Gio and be like, hey, it's all right. Like, your moment's coming, something like that. Where on the other end, but you do kind of see that, right? Like, an example of like, being a coach's son. Well, obviously Gregg's not his dad,
right?
But there's different ways that, dads handle that situation of coaching their son, right? Yeah. Some are, obviously, play their son at starting quarterback, even if he's not the best quarterback on the team. But there are others that takes maybe even sort of an opposite approach where they're like unfairly hard on a player, on their son that's on their team. So it's like, you're right, and maybe that Gregg took that approach where he's close to this kid, so he feels an obligation to show other people that he's not going to show favoritism just because he's close to him. So it could go either way, but it is an interesting dynamic, and I had no idea how close like the two were. I knew obviously they were teammates and they had some sort of relationship, but that like they're best man. Like it's crazy to me that you can let a relationship spiral like that so quickly.
Spring break canceled for these families. So getting to the crazy drama today. So I'm going to present it in the form of two articles, an ESPN article and an article from The Athletic, who generally both tend to be, on the two sources on top of U.S. soccer, I would say. But I'm going to start with the ESPN article because I think that one is more focused on Gio's father, Claudio Reyna, who chronologically would be accused of his wrongdoings during the course of the World Cup. So allegedly, and this is going off an ESPN article, Claudio Reyna also sent multiple messages to USMNT General Manager Brian McBride and Stewart during the World Cup, in which he shared his frustration about Gio's World Cup experience, and Claudio owned up to that. However, multiple sources told ESPN he threatened to share allegations about Berhalter's past to those executives at ESPN, in other words, to force them to make a decision. Now, Reyna has actually come out and denied those allegations. He said, while in Qatar, I shared my frustrations about my son's World Cup experience with a number of close friends, including a couple executives. However, at no time did I threaten anyone, nor would I ever do so. Now, there's multiple ESPN sources going against that. This would be a great time for the receipts, but if you were to analyze Claudio's kind of situation, he's the technical director, some position like that at Austin FC in the MLS. Do you think he's going full deny here, or like full push through a lie, or you think would you go against these ESPN sources? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, my first sort of clarification. So did Claudio, was that him just texting his like annoyance about the playing situation, or did he bring up the incident from 30 years ago prior to Gregg coming out and kind of slamming Gio?
So according to ESPN, Reyna threatened to share allegations about Berhalter's past.
Okay,
to these
that
people.
Was prior to even Gregg coming out with anything about.
Correct.
It was prior to the leadership conference.
Exactly. Prior to timeline's important. Prior to the leadership conference that really pissed Gio off. In other words.
Yeah, and so I guess the Reynas maybe obviously their actions aside, I can understand being upset over, more the comments, that getting out about their son. I can understand maybe as a parent being frustrated over that. But for those comments to come out before that, just because of a lack of playing time, is absurd. And the thing that gets me the most about this is like just even before we get to the, the threats about the incident, like just the hubris of Claudio Reyna and both of the Reynas to just like feel like they are entitled to be able to text or the leadership of the USMNT, like just to be able to feel like they have the power to be like, hey, like this isn't right. This isn't a local club team. This is the U.S. men's national team. Yeah. You're a parent of a player. Yeah, you used to be on the team, but you're parents of a player that was lucky enough to be selected to this team. You don't have the right to just text people and say, oh, this isn't a club, like a local club soccer team. Yeah. This is the top level of international soccer. Like the fact that they had the audacity to even go there. Yeah. Is just wrong from the start and just shows a lack of character in the first place. And that's even before we get to the bringing up the old incident. That's just like, you don't do that. This isn't fucking like the soccer's FC. Yeah. So that before we even get to the incident, I thought was absurd.
Yeah. I completely agree. There's somebody who tweeted, like, what way to show the world what American soccer is all about than to have a kid, like, complain about his son's playing time.
Exactly.
True representation. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned him, like, how he used to be on the team. Maybe this is, like, a much bigger point that's hard to articulate, but the vibe of U.S. soccer sometimes, it's like you got the execs are Brian McBride and Ernie Stewart. It's like, they were good players for the U.S., I guess. Mm-hmm. And by the way, like, you're in talking about handing jobs to like former players. This is the United States. This is not some like fantastic soccer nation. That like, like these guys, hoofed and ran with all due respect. But you have like two players as the execs. You got this guy Heath Pierce in the media talking about, like, oh, it's gonna pop off tomorrow, and it's like it just, and then you got Stu Holden and Alexi Lalas doing your World Cup coverage. Yeah. It's like there's no. Can I just get a Woj in here? Like it's like strictly like former players who have now do this for a living, and with like a severe lack of ethos to me. And I mean, not severe lack of ethos, but some lack of ethos. I just get tired of it. I'm like, tired of me.
It really is kind of like the old boys club.
Yeah,
and it's not even like and the old boys club comes into play everywhere, right? There's big time former players are coaching club teams all over the world, but Zidane. Yeah, maybe you can consider him the old boys club, but he's also one of the greatest players ever, right? These like you could say for those people, like, all right, this maybe is a little bit of an old boys club, but there's maybe a reason why they get some leniency because they were legends. This U.S. men's national team leadership, it's the old boys club of complete mediocrity, right? It really and like especially the way the situation's transpired, Claudio and all the people from USMNT involved. It's just like, what are these guys doing?
Yeah,
like, it's a clown show and it's a joke and it sucks.
Yeah, some people are specifically calling for like whoever gets this next job can't be best man of somebody's kid. Like you can't have these just crazy interwoven things that allow these emotional like incidents to happen. Now, this is still an absolutely remarkable story that like you really would not expect to happen at any point, but nonetheless, it's a compelling argument to really have somebody fresh, somebody like Potch, like you said on the last podcast. So to get to what I view, if I really think the Claudio Reyna incident frames how you feel about this next one. Do you believe that this guy, they stooped to this level of really getting mad about playing time and threatening people over their son's playing time? Because if you do, you probably are willing to accept that these people would do anything petty to, get back at, or just to, have vengeance over playing time. But if you believe Claudio Reyna that they didn't do it, then I think there's a lot more wiggle room for how you treat his mother's side of the story, Danielle Reyna. I should say Danielle, not Daniela. But so anyways, goes to the article from Athletic, probably the biggest bomb of all of it. So here goes. The information given to the U.S. Soccer Federation regarding a 1991 incident involving men's national team World Cup coach Gregg Berhalter and his wife originated from her college roommate Danielle Reyna, the mother of U.S. winger Gio Reyna, she said in a statement to The Athletic. So she's coming forth and confessing to be the person that gave up this information on December 11th as previously mentioned in the U.S. Soccer report. Multiple sources familiar with the matter told The Athletic that an ongoing investigation initiated in December was prompted by the information shared by Daniela to U.S. Soccer sporting director Ernie Stewart. Again, one of the kind of boys club guys we said. So this is Danielle Reyna's statement that she sent to The Athletic. To set the record straight, I did call U.S. Sporting Director Ernie Stewart. I've known him for years and considered him to be a close friend. So she called him immediately in the wake of these comments emerging from the Leadership Summit. I wanted to let Ernie know that I was absolutely outraged and devastated that Gio had been put in such a terrible position and that I felt very personally betrayed by the actions of someone my family had considered a friend for decades, that being Coach Gregg Berhalter, who divulged the information at the leadership conference. As part of that conversation, I told Ernie that I thought it was especially unfair that Gio, who had apologized for acting immaturely about his playing time, was still being dragged through the mud when Gregg had asked for and received forgiveness for doing something so much worse at the same age. Give me your takes before I get too out of it.
Just like to bring that up as just like for someone that did that at the same age is just so absurd. And like to bring, and it's also the thing that strikes me about the way it was handled is like, if they're as close as we've known them to be, best man at each other's wedding, like there's maybe some reason to be upset at the way they came out from Gregg, but at that point, why don't you just go to your best man and close friend and like handle that between yourselves? Yeah. I mean, like just to bring that in is just ridiculous. And from a parent's perspective, I can understand the frustration of it coming out. Like I can understand that, but the reaction is just, there's not an excuse for it. I don't think.
Okay. So I'm going to continue to read this one. This next sentence is huge. Without going into detail, the statements from yesterday significantly minimized the abuse on the night in question. Rosalind Berhalter was my roommate, teammate, and best friend. I supported her through the trauma that followed. It took me a long time to forgive and accept Gregg afterwards. Like two best friends that go way back. That's so crazy. But I worked hard to give him grace, and ultimately I made both of them and their kids a huge part of my family's life. I would have wanted and expected him to give the same grace to Gio. That's why this current situation is so very hurtful and hard. At the time I called Ernie, many people were trashing Gio on social media due to Gregg's comments. I didn't know when or if this would stop. I just wanted Ernie to help me make sure that there would be no further unwarranted attacks on my son. I thought our conversation would remain in confidence. It didn't occur to me at the time that anything I said could lead to an investigation. I'm not criticizing Ernie here. Essentially, she understands why they would have to investigate a claim like that. I very much commend the recent efforts by U.S. Soccer to address abuse of women's players. I understand that he had an obligation to investigate. But I want to be clear in saying I did not ask for Gregg to be fired. I did not make any threats. I don't know anything about any blackmail attempts, nor have I ever had any discussions with anybody else on Gregg's staff. I don't know any of the other coaches. I did not communicate with anyone in U.S. Soccer about this matter before December 11th, and no one else in my family has made any statements to U.S. Soccer regarding Gregg's past at all. In other words, she is directly refuting ESPN's claims that Claudio Reyna was sending threats. And then Claudio said he supports his wife, and then that was where that quote about him came out, that, he never threatened anyone. Right. So this is what I want to get into. Before we get into the big sentence here, which I believe is the big sentence, where she essentially says that Gregg Berhalter lied and minimized how abusive that night was with his account. To play devil's advocate to your saying that there's no reason she should have said that. I was on Twitter during that Gio Reyna drama, and it's wild. Like people are going absolutely crazy. They were trashing this kid, saying, as much as they were saying that Gregg was also extremely at fault, they were saying things about Gio, about his lack of professionalism. And having gone through what Gio Reyna has gone through in the past year and a half, people forget that he's had a terrible, lives in Germany. He's been hurt a ton of the time. He's actually talked publicly about how that's affected just his mental health in terms of, being on the couch and knowing he couldn't go play soccer, which is really the only reason he's left so much at home to go be in Germany, right? And so with all that emotion tied up, you have this just complete fumbling by U.S. Soccer, where Gregg Berhalter goes and talks at this conference, which I think it would be reasonable to come back to as what a terrible, terrible, stupid mistake. And I actually can see where she gets on the phone, obviously angry or upset, and kind of gets into a conversation where maybe she starts rambling on about Gregg. She's probably mad at Gregg. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe she's to some degree knows what she's doing, but uses this example of, hey, well, Gregg messed up royally, and now look at what he's doing, punishing my son for doing something way less bad, and is just kind of dumbfounded and is thinking to herself, how did Gregg? How can't he have some compassion and understanding when I know he messed up in this way? Maybe she's just I know Gregg messed up a bunch of times. Hey, I can even think of one time he kicked his wife. So I can actually sort of see that playing out.
I could see how that could come out, and I understand the mama bear, instincts and how that plays a role in this. But where this starts is just as a mom of you don't have the right to just be texting and calling the head of U.S. Soccer to begin with. Yeah. And in Gregg's defense,
you think so? And I very much agreed. During the World Cup stuff. So you don't think that you think she's wrong for picking up the phone after the essentially leadership conference stuff came out?
I think she could pick up the phone, but call I would say call Gregg and not U.S. Soccer. I would say deal with Gregg. I think it's maybe fair to say Gregg made a mistake, but at the same time, I don't think Gregg is responsible for social media hate that goes around. That's the reality of the world we're in today. I don't think you could say, oh, that's Gregg's fault. Yeah. Number two, at the end of the day, maybe a PR mistake on Gregg's part. I would concede that, but these are professional players. This is the world we live in with the media. Yeah. All of this shit comes out. It doesn't matter who you are. Ronaldo, we just had a situation with Ronaldo at Manchester United where he's on talk shows with peers more. This is the world. This is professional soccer.
Everything gets out.
Everything gets out. Yeah. So I understand, she's upset, and I understand Gregg may have made a mistake that warrants maybe a little animosity from the Reynas. Yeah. But this is professional soccer. This is not, again, this is professional soccer. This is not Soccer's FC. Yeah. This is the world we live in with media and the world of international soccer. So it's unfortunate that it happened, but I still I do not think there's any excuse for how it transpired. I guess, the line though about it being more severe, I think is interesting, but we can talk a little bit more about that. But
yeah, I think that line certainly gets into, it makes you question motives a little bit. For me, here's one way I look at it. If you're really playing devil's advocate for her, if she's saying it was more severe, therefore it took lots of mercy for me to forgive Gregg Berhalter, therefore I expect that level of mercy that equates to such a bad thing for him to my child, I sort of understand the logic there. However, what that one sentence really feels to me like is Mrs. Reyna, Danielle, kind of opening the door for this mysterious what happened on that night surrounding Gregg Berhalter, right? And that's not something that's good for him as he heads into a period where, he might be potentially looking for a job. It's unclear whether he's going to come back to the U.S. We know he might have aspirations of club soccer. And for me, like, her saying something like Gregg Berhalter effectively lied and it was way worse seems like a vengeance thing. It seems like a cutting kind of remark, and one that for me opens the door for saying were all these actions kind of made in the spirit of revenge, although I kind of like her story other than I think what she's saying makes a ton of sense. That there is a kind of sketchy point that maybe Gregg Berhalter will have to respond to again. But yeah, Max, you're kind of closing thoughts on that whole phone call.
Yeah, I mean, where I stand on it just doesn't seem proportionate. The response, like, for what Gregg did Gregg make a mistake maybe with the Gio situation? Sure. But to bring that in as the response just seems completely disproportionate to what the situation warranted. And at the end of it, where I kind of end up is I feel bad for Gio Reyna.
Yeah.
At the end of this, as a young player, maybe he didn't handle the situation well in terms of playing time. But at the end of the day, he's a 20-year-old kid.
Yeah.
I wasn't mature. I was only 24 years ago. I wasn't mature as a 20-year-old kid. I was still in college. We were still doing dumb stuff. He's not a fully grown adult. These are fully grown adults. And to handle the situation in this way is really just going to result in an much more negative impact on Gio's career than it would have had before this.
Yeah.
Because now Gio's maybe in a little bit of the doghouse, but in a situation where he can have a good season for Dortmund. He could get back in the good graces and actually get playing time. He's in a situation where he's got a clean slate, basically. Right. And it's kind of like you mentioned in the last podcast, like he's kind of, making the
fuel even, right?
Yeah, he's supposed to be making the transition from a young prospect to a legitimate, star player.
Right.
And now all of this stuff comes out and casts just such a big cloud, not only over his U.S. career, but I think this could cast a shadow of his overall mental health and play into his club career. Because this isn't a player that's been known to deal well with adversity so far. So how do you think he's going to deal with this? Yeah. So I feel bad for him, assuming obviously that he had nothing to do with this.
Right.
But
I feel bad. Really sounds like you did.
I feel bad for him because he's going to be, I think, very much negatively impacted by the actions of his parents, adults who should know better. And he's a 20-year-old kid, and he's going to, really bear the consequences, and that sucks, I think.
Yeah, I think to kind of even expand on that, like, it's a really sad, like, it's sad to the rarity of two couples having independent best friends being like getting married, right? And all this and having a really good relationship and the dream of coaching one of those kids on the national team, all these stars aligning things to end in insane, just, frontline news madness, alleged threats and investigations it's a crazy story. It's deserving of headlines. Like it's the bottom line is it's sad for these two families, and I especially feel terrible for Gio and for Gregg Berhalter's wife, who doesn't bear any responsibility for any comments, anything like that. Any she said, like, just having to relive a really terrible part of their life. So. Yeah, hopefully everyone is able to move past this. I don't think anybody wants any more part of this. It's and I mean, we thought it was dead before, but hopefully it is this time. But yeah, so look out for maybe some transfer stuff as this January transfer stuff or January transfer window opens. We may be back doing it as we kind of transition into more of like a general coverage thing with the U.S. men's national team. Thanks for listening. We appreciate it, and have a good one.